The movie is based on the true story of an infamous American serial killer named Jeffrey Dahmer. From 1978 to 1991, Jeffrey murdered 17 men and boys in the most horrific ways. Rape, dismemberment, necrophilia, cannibalism, and whatnot he did. This movie shows us Jeffrey Dahmer's life during his high school years, the time when he was an awkward, lonely kid, before he became the psychotic killer he is known for. The movie begins as we see Jeffrey Dahmer sitting alone on the school bus, when he notices a grown man jogging, and was so fascinated by the man that he gets up from his seat just to watch him. We find that Jeffrey has an obsession with the man, as he keeps watching the man even after the bus drops him off. Afterwards, Jeffrey is seen carrying a plastic bag, and when he stumbles upon a couple of neighborhood teens, he explains that he's carrying a dead cat he found and is going to try and dissolve it in acid, as he has access to acid because his father is a chemist. Out of curiosity, the boys follow Jeffrey to his father's shed, and watch as he dissolves the cat, while Jeffrey explains that the dissolving process will take a month because the acid is weak. He is doing this because he loves bones and is interested in what's inside the body. However, the boys are skeptical that Jeffrey is just pouring normal water into the jar instead of acid, so Jeffrey shows them another cat he found earlier, by aggressively breaking the jar in which he kept it to dissolve. The boys find themselves disgusted by the strong odor and Jeffrey's weird nature, so they call him a freak and leave. We then follow Jeffrey as he goes through his daily life. His family and life look no more than ordinary. He has a caring father who constantly quarrels with his mother, and a loud younger brother. During the dinner, his father says that he wants Jeffrey to become more social and enjoy his school life. But at school, his classmates think he's weird and some even bully him, except for one similarly awkward boy, who he sits next to at lunch, and the boy asks Jeffrey to go to see a concert together. But aside from that, he sits alone in biology class, and seems fascinated by a preserved animal inside a jar in the lab. Later, when Jeffrey gets home, we learn that he has stolen the preserved animal to keep to himself. But when he gets inside the house, he sees that his parents are arguing once more and don't care that their sons are listening, so he quietly guides his little brother away to keep from having to listen. One day after the school band practice, Jeffrey finds his only friend getting harassed by the bullies, but he chooses to ignore him and walks away. Later that day, his dad comes home early from work and gets angry when he realizes that Jeffrey has made no progress in making friends at school, but is spending too much time with his preserved animals inside the shed. And so, the dad storms into his shed, and begins throwing his preserved animals into the trash can, while scolding him to try and be more normal and stop all this. From now on, the father will shut the shed and take it down. Next day, Jeffrey tries to stay on the school grounds, but is approached by a drug dealer classmate named Fig, who tries to sell him some, but Jeffrey decides to walk home instead. On his way, he waits by the side of the road while staring at his bone collection in deep thoughts, until the very same jogger guy passes by, and catches his interest yet again. Later at home, his father apologizes for being harsh, and explains that he doesn't want Jeffrey to end up like him, who spends too much time in labs and doesn't have many friends. The father tries to lighten up his mood by bringing him a pair of dumbbells, hoping that Jeffrey might get into working out, and be able to impress a pretty girl someday. To satisfy his father, he begins working out, but still secretly spends his days out in the woods, trapping small animals in hopes of collecting their bones. One day in class, a history teacher tries asking him a question, but Jeffrey, who is too lazy to answer, decides to speak to the teacher with a silly voice, which surprisingly gets the entire class laughing, and Jeffrey sees this as an opportunity to make new friends, so when he's walking down the hallway later, he starts making random noises and doing weird gestures, and he even pretends to have a seizure to get everyone to laugh. And it actually worked, until the bell rings and everyone goes to their class, leaving him alone. This eventually becomes a thing he's known for, and one day a group of teenage boys who think Jeffrey is hilarious asks him to sit with them for lunch. They are Durf, Mike, and Neil. It turns out that Jeffrey imitated the speech and gestures of his mother's interior decorator, who has some kind of disorder. Surprisingly, they get along pretty well, and it is here that Durf and his friends form the Jeffrey fan club, and also plan to do some epic pranks to spirit up their senior year. They start with getting Jeffrey to make random noises in the library, and have the librarian blame someone else for it. Up next, they run down the hallway while pretending to have seizures together. However, in between Jeffrey's seemingly improving social life, one day he discovers that his mother, who was a former drug addict, is having a relapse. He tries to convince her to stop and go to the doctor, but fails. Despite it all, he goes on with his days, but one day, something weird happens when he's out fishing with his friends. After hooking a fish, his friends ask him to let the poor fish go, but Jeffrey, however, butchers the fish violently, claiming that he wanted to know what's inside its body. His friends of course find this disturbing, but doesn't pay much attention. Later, we get to know that Neil is a photographer for the school's yearbook, so they plan their next prank. Jeffrey comes up with the idea to put himself in every school club's yearbook picture, and they all agree to this. The following day, they start to carry out their plan, and in the end, the boys manage to perfectly pull off this prank. Afterwards, Jeffrey comes home bringing his friend Durf, to excitedly announce to his dad that he has joined a lot of clubs this year, but his dad is too occupied arguing with his mom to notice. The fight eventually makes Durf feel awkward, so he excuses himself and goes home. We get to know that Jeffrey makes it a habit to secretly hide behind the trees just to wait for the jogger to pass, seemingly having developed a crush on the grown man. Until one day, it just so happens that the three of them are hanging out, right when the jogger arrives and is greeted by Mike. As it turns out, he is Mike's family doctor, Dr. Matthews. We see that young Jeffrey is nervous due to the presence of Dr. Matthews, but his friends doesn't seem to notice. When Jeffrey comes home, he finds his parents fighting again, this time over his mother suddenly buying a car. The frustrated dad takes a bottle of liquor to calm himself down, which Jeffrey secretly steals, and that's when he starts drinking. Next day, Jeffrey and his friends were casually talking, when they were approached by Fig, who shows off the fact that his former Nazi father just gave him a pocket knife. He then cuts himself with it, and starts sucking his own blood, which three of them finds disgusting, but not Jeffrey, who seemingly finds it interesting. As time goes on, Jeffrey becomes an alcoholic, and he starts coming to school drunk, which Durf notices. He also still secretly goes around collecting roadkills, and dissects them after. One day, he goes on an overnight school trip to Washington, D.C., during which he has to share his room with Charlie, the only black person in his entire class. Jeffrey carefully checks him out, and suddenly asks him a disturbing question, which is whether a black person's internal organs are the same color as a white person's. Charlie finds him weird, so he decides to ignore him. When the boys were walking down the streets of Washington next day, they joke about getting an interview with the vice president for their school newspaper. But Jeffrey takes it seriously, so he reaches for the nearest payphone and makes a call to the White House, and somehow, he manages to get an interview with the vice president himself. They enter the White House and meet the vice president, who asks them superficial questions about what they want to be when they grow up, to which Jeffrey simply answers biology. The trip ends, but Jeffrey's happiness from the trip doesn't last long, because as soon as he gets into the car, his father breaks the news that he and his mother are on the verge of divorce, and that his dad has decided to live in a motel for the time being. Jeffrey is devastated hearing this, and we can see him lie awake in his bed later that night. Between the thoughts of life and his growing crush on Dr. Matthews, he comes up with an idea. He fakes a fever so that he can get an appointment with Dr. Matthews, and he can examine Jeffrey naked. But Dr. Matthews becomes uncomfortable during the hernia examination, when he notices that Jeffrey has an erection. This of course makes the situation awkward, and his infatuation with the doctor strong. He is now becoming aware of his sexuality, and finds himself completely silent when his friends are talking about girls. Jeffrey begins drinking at school as well, and his friends also start noticing his odd behavior lately. It is finally the day when the yearbook photos get printed, every single one of which has Jeffrey in it. But unfortunately, a teacher walks in on the three boys laughing at the pictures, and realizes what they're up to, so she starts crossing out Jeffrey's face on every single one of them, which completely ruins their plan. Meanwhile, Jeffrey is drowning in both his parents' divorce as well as his sexual awakening. His parents argue again and again over the custody of the kids and other things when they meet. So when he gets home right after, he locks himself in his room, and lays in his bed, cuddling Dr. Matthews' dead body. But luckily, it's only his imagination. On the other side of the town, Jeffrey's friends are out at a party, where some classmates tease them as Jeffrey has been ignoring hanging out with them lately, which is a shame because Jeffrey is the reason people even pay attention to them. Feeling challenged, Durf bets that he could get Jeffrey to do the fake seizure at the mall this weekend, an idea which Neil isn't too happy about, because he feels they're treating Jeffrey like a zoo attraction. Still, Durf goes on with his plan and bribes Jeffrey with some money to get him to say yes. And so that weekend, a very drunk-looking Jeffrey sits in the back seat of Durf's car as they drive up to the mall. Once they arrive, Jeffrey goes on and performs his seizure acts, while his school friends watch and laugh. One of them is even recording the entire thing, as Jeffrey proceeds to publicly humiliate himself for their entertainment. This goes on for a while, until Jeffrey appears to have grown visibly tired of this, and rejoins his friends with a dull look on his face, as he's come to realize that he's just a spectacle to these guys. If that's not enough, then when he gets home, he's informed by his mother that they have finalized the divorce, and his father is getting the house. Next day, the increasingly unstable Jeffrey arms himself with a baseball bat, and waits for Dr. Matthews to pass, but he never does. This prompts him to lose his patience, and start beating the bat against the tree until it breaks. That same day, 2 neighborhood kids discover a disemboweled dead body of an animal, which becomes the talk of the school the very next day, because people find it creepy how someone would do that. Jeffrey's friends then start talking about prom, and Mike makes fun of Jeffrey by saying there's no way any girl would want to go to prom with him. This offends Jeffrey, so he goes right ahead and asks a freshman named Bridget to prom. Initially she refuses, because she knows that Jeffrey always does weird things, but he convinces her by saying that going to the prom with a senior has its own benefits, like instant popularity among seniors. And so they end up awkwardly going together, but still enough to surprise his friends. Later, Neil, who was against making fun of Jeffrey at the mall, apologizes to Jeffrey on behalf of others, which Jeffrey accepts. When it is time to dance with his date, we can see that Jeffrey grows uncomfortable, as he was never attracted to women to begin with. And so he excuses himself, and retreats to his car, preferring to be alone. Next day when he comes home from school, he finds her mother stuffing her things inside the car and taking his brother with her to live with her relatives. This breaks Jeffrey's heart, because this means his brother and mother won't be attending his graduation. He doesn't say a word when his mother tries to talk to him, but after they leave, he breaks down and cries inside the house for hours. On his graduation day, Jeffrey doesn't seem excited at all, and here his father congratulates him and hands him the keys to the family car, being unaware that his mother has left him completely alone. Few days later, Durf finds Jeffrey walking alone by the side of the road, and decides to give him a ride home. When they arrive, Durf notices how there's blood on Jeffrey's fingertips, but Jeffrey tells him that it's just paint. They then have an awkward conversation about their friendship, during which Durf basically refuses to apologize for treating Jeffrey like a zoo attraction. Pissed off, he purposefully invites Durf inside for a beer. Inside, Jeffrey scares him when he stands too close to him, so he begins walking away saying his mother is waiting for him. We watch in fear as Jeffrey grabs a bat, and is about to strike him with it. But fortunately for Durf, he makes it fast to his car, and so Jeffrey had to leave him this time. Once Jeffrey is alone, he freaks out over the thoughts that came to his mind when he was with Durf. Next morning, Jeffrey gets inside his new car given by his dad, and drives around. But shortly after, he stops by to pick up a good-looking hitchhiker named Stephen Mark Hicks. Jeffrey is instantly infatuated by him, so he offers him a ride. And thereafter, Stephen Mark Hicks was never seen again. This is where the movie ends. Subscribe to the channel if you love movies. Like and share the video, we appreciate it. See you again.